Just imagine for the moment that you are the coach of a sports team. It might be a football team, it might be an ice hockey team, whatever it is, but halfway through the game, your team is losing. And as the coach of the team, you have that opportunity to give your team the halftime talk. It's the most important talk you ever give. You want the team to win. So what are you going to say to the team to spur them on and encourage them so that they'll win the game? Well, you're going to have to be careful to speak to them in the right way. You'll have to decide what you need to say, but also how you need to say it. So it might be, for example, the team haven't been trying very hard. You've been watching them play and you're disappointed, and so you're going to rebuke them for their lack of effort. Or maybe you've seen the team trying very hard and they've just been unlucky. A couple of decisions have gone against them. You're going to want to encourage them to keep going and spur them on. How you speak to them will depend on the situation. Maybe they're playing a team that is much better than them, and you don't think they've got any chance of winning. And so what you need to say to them is to encourage them to play their best for the sake of pride. How you choose to speak will depend on how they're feeling and what they need. Or imagine you go home from a Christian conference, you've been away, and I'll say it's a man going home. Apologies, ladies, but you'll understand why. A man goes home after a Christian conference, and he arrives home and he thinks, what we really need is a nice romantic evening together. And he walks through the door and he discovers the children have been awful for the time that he's away. The washing machine has broken down. His wife is fraught. At that moment, suggesting that she get dressed and they have a nice romantic evening together is probably not going to go well. It's the wrong moment, and maybe it might be expressed in the wrong way. Emotional intelligence is all about learning to be able to communicate to people in the right way at the right time. Leadership, the essence of leadership, is, I think, about the exercise of authority to organize and motivate others to achieve a common goal. Let me say that again. Leadership is about the exercise of authority to organize and motivate others to achieve a common goal. And much of our leadership is about speaking to people, telling them what they need to do, asking them to do things, motivating them, encouraging them to do things. A lot of our work is by speaking into people and into situations. We need to be able to communicate, to persuade, and to encourage. And emotional intelligence is learning the skill to be able to do that well. It's the skill of being able to speak the right thing at the right time in the right way. One of the challenges that we face as leaders is we might have a very clear idea of what ought to happen, what people ought to do, or what's needed. And we think because we understand if we just tell people, we'll lead well and the task will be accomplished. But even though we might be right about what needs to happen or what people need to do, we can effectively say the wrong thing or the right thing in the wrong way at the wrong time. And that undermines our leadership. So our emotional intelligence is this skill of being able to communicate and persuade our leadership in a wise way to people. When we are wise in the way that we communicate, when we exercise this emotional intelligence, then it will strengthen our leadership. Rather than alienating people, people will want to follow us. The people we're leading will feel understood and cared for. They'll enjoy being led. So I think this is an important skill for leading. So what is emotional intelligence? Well, one of the definitions that people have used is this. It's there on your sheet. The capacity to be aware of, control, and express one's emotions, and to handle relationships judicially and empathetically. It's basically the skill of relating well to people, taking account of their emotions and empathizing with them. As I've said, it involves relating and communicating well, being able to say the right thing at the right time, in the right way, and with the right tone. And lots of research has shown that this skill makes a huge contribution to leadership success. We might not think it does, but all the evidence shows that it makes a huge difference. Some surveys have shown that something like 67% of superior leadership success is down to emotional intelligence. It's been suggested that it is twice as important as IQ, intelligence, or technical expertise. You can be a very intelligent, very technically competent leader, but if you have a lack of emotional intelligence, your leadership will not be as successful as it can be. I lead a network of churches, and one of the difficult circumstances I sometimes have to deal with is situations where there's been a breakdown of relationship between a pastor and a congregation. And I find that very often that has been because the pastor has lacked emotional intelligence. He hasn't empathized with the congregation, he hasn't understood them. Instead, he simply told them what to do and expected that they will do what he said. He's not understood their fears, their concerns. He's not communicated well. He might know what would be a good thing to do, but he hasn't communicated and connected with the people that he is leading. So emotional intelligence has a significant impact on our leadership. And I think in a simple way, this idea of emotional intelligence, which is a secular idea, is also deeply biblical. The Bible tells us that we are to love our neighbour as ourselves. It seems to me this is just an aspect of loving others. As we seek to lead and communicate with others, it is loving to try to understand them, to empathise with them, and to be able to communicate in the way that they can best understand. It's not just that it works, I think that it's biblical love in action. So that's what emotional intelligence is. Why is emotional intelligence needed? Why is emotional intelligence necessary? And I think the reason why emotional intelligence is necessary is really for two reasons. Firstly, all people are different. All people are different. And emotional intelligence is really recognizing that every person is different. We know that, don't we? We know that there are people who have different personality types. People have different characters. People have had different experiences which have shaped them. Which means that people won't respond to the same thing in the same way. For example, some people are primarily people who think and reason. In order to persuade people who think and reason, you need to be able to use a good argument. There are people you perhaps need to present a logical argument to win them over. Other people are more emotional in how they make decisions. Their feelings are much more important to them. People who are more orientated around feelings are less likely to respond just to an argument. They often need stories that engage their emotions and draw them in to understand what you're trying to say. And some people are primarily people who are activists. They're concerned about doing. And they're going to be persuaded not just by logical arguments or even stories, but by somebody setting them an example or showing them. So different people work in different ways. Some people are introverts, whereas other people are extroverts. They respond very differently. Some people are secure in themselves. Some people have a high level of insecurity. Some people are very self-confident, whereas other people feel very inadequate. So if you are rebuking somebody or wanting to challenge them, a person who's very self-confident might cope with a strong rebuke. Whereas a person who feels inadequate and feels a personal sense of failure may be crushed by that same challenge or rebuke. They require much more encouragement and exhortation. Men and women can be very different in the way that they relate. Often men are tend to prefer arguments and are happier sometimes with more robust engagement. For many women, relationship is much, much more important. So people are very different. And anybody who has been a parent will know that if they have more than one child. I have 4 children, ranging from age 17 to 12. 3 girls and 1 boy. And they are all very different. We cannot parent them the same. If you think you can have one rule that will be applied in the same way to every child, it doesn't work. So I see this in my children. When it comes to disobeying or rebelling, some of my children feel naturally very guilty when they've done something wrong. They need to be encouraged of their parents' ongoing love. Others of my children, they don't care that they've done something wrong. They need it to be brought home to them that they've disobeyed. But you need to treat each of them differently because of who they are and paying attention to how they're feeling. And emotional intelligence is the skill of just taking account of the fact that each person is different. But not only is each person different, each moment is different. So the moment at which you speak to someone or you speak to your team or to your church will be a unique moment. It may be at a particular moment everybody is feeling discouraged because of something that's happened. Or it may be that everybody is feeling elated. People may be very excited about the future and a vision you're presenting, or they may be very fearful because they think you're going to be suggesting change, and maybe their jobs might be at risk. They may be feeling tired because of how hard they've been working. So it's not just different people, but it's also the moment in which you're speaking to them that you need to take account of. And emotional intelligence is just being sensitive to who you're speaking to and engaging with and trying to help, and the particular moment at which you're trying to speak to them. Now, the importance of emotional intelligence has been recognised and can be seen in a variety of books and resources that have become popular and common. So this is not a new idea, it's an idea that's increasingly significant and recognised. Many of us might be used to various kinds of personality type tests that have been developed. Myers-Briggs type tests. They're tools to help recognize different kinds of personalities so that we can know how to relate and how to engage more effectively. It enables us to both know ourselves and to know others. But just some other examples. One very popular book in recent years is the book by Gary Chapman called The 5 Love Languages. I don't know whether you've ever read that book, but really it's just an example of emotional intelligence. Its basic thesis is that we all express love and want to experience love in different ways. Some things are more meaningful to us than others. So there are some people who want to be loved, first of all, or primarily by receiving words of affirmation. They want to hear you say, I love you, I appreciate you. There are others who appreciate being loved by receiving gifts that are thoughtful and appropriate. For some people, they want to be loved by experiencing serving actions. Somebody's done something for you. For others, they want love to be expressed by affirming touch. For others, what they really value is you spending quality time with them. Now, those are, of course, appropriate to a marriage, but they can also be relevant in the way that we relate to leadership teams, recognizing that different people want to be appreciated in different ways. All it's doing is it's saying that if you want to really connect with somebody, you have to think about what will be most meaningful to them. You want to express love, but it's not enough just to want to express love in the way you do. You need to think about what will help them to understand they're being loved. So you can miscommunicate. You can do something that you think is loving, but it's not felt that way. It's just a helpful insight that it's not our own motivations and desires that are necessarily always determinative. The question is, have we connected with the other person? A book that's more orientated around leadership issues that I've found helpful is a book by Kubitschek and Cockram, which is called 5 Voices: How to Communicate Effectively with Everyone You Lead. It basically speaks of how many people have a dominant characteristic, and it's important to take that dominant characteristic into account when you communicate with them in leadership. They identify 5 fundamental kind of groupings. And you might recognize yourself or you might recognize others. They say there are some people who are pioneers. Pioneers are people who love something new. They love the challenge. They love the big vision. They love the risk. They're always ready to step out immediately with a good idea. They're the enthusiasts for taking risks. Then you have people who are creative. They love coming up with innovative ideas. They're quite precious about those ideas because they're very important to them. But they're creative. There are people who are collaborators. Collaborators are people who, above all else, love working with other people. They're always wanting to build connections and find people to work with. Pioneers are quite often individualists. Collaborators want to work with others. Then there are nurturers. Nurturers are who are people who always think the most important thing is caring for other people. They're always worried about whether people will get hurt. They want to make sure that everybody is being properly cared for and looked after. And then his last category is the category of what he calls guardians. And guardians are the people who are ultra risk averse. They're the ones who never want to spend any money, never want to take any risks. They're the people who respond to every new idea with the answer, no, that won't work. And he says that the problem in leadership is just we all have those sorts of dispositions. We all tend to fall primarily into one or other of those categories. And often the challenge in our leadership is that we don't think about the fact that other people are not like us. Most leaders of churches and Christian organisations that are growing are pioneers. They're the people who love ideas, they love challenge, they love to push forwards. And often they find it very difficult to relate to those who are guardians, who are worried about there not being enough money and things not working out. And so they can be real tension. And all the book is really saying is it helps to understand what people are like so that you can persuade them in the best way. So these are just tools. They're not specifically Christian tools, but they are tools that help us to think about the fact that people are different and that each moment is different so that we can communicate and persuade in the best possible way. So what does emotional intelligence involve then? What do you need to do to be emotionally intelligent? Well, I think there are two aspects to emotional intelligence. Firstly, you need to understand yourself. Emotional intelligence means you need to understand yourself. What are you like? What is it that drives you? What kind of person are you? And how does that affect the way that you communicate and the assumptions that you make about what is persuasive to others? So if you're a pioneer, for example, you will sort of think that others will be persuaded by a big vision and excitement. So you need to understand yourself and then realize that that is how you come across to others. So we need to be self-understanding. And then, of course, we need to understand others, the people that we're seeking to lead. Maybe that might be the members of our team. It might be the kind of members of our church or sections of the members of our church. But we need to give thought to who they are and what they're like. What are their concerns? How do they relate? What's persuasive to them? What are they most fearful of? And then as we think about who we are and who they are, we need to thoughtfully work out what is the best way of communicating and persuading those people. So emotional intelligence involves the understanding of yourself and the understanding of others. And it's not about saying that the way you are or the way other people are is either right or wrong. It's simply recognizing that there's a difference and making sure that you work well despite that difference. So emotional intelligence is the understanding of yourself and the understanding of others. And gaining that understanding will help you to be much more effective in leadership, in communicating, persuading, gaining trust and mutual understanding, and gaining the loyalty of your team. And it's crucial to remember that the goal of leadership is to win others over, not to win over them. I think sometimes as leaders we fall into thinking that our task is to win over others, to beat them, whereas actually we're to win them over so that they're with us in the common task. Now you might be saying, that's all very well, that sounds very practical, maybe that sounds like secular psychology. Is that at all biblical? Is that a biblical component of leadership? And although the Bible nowhere uses the word emotional intelligence, I think the idea of emotional intelligence runs all the way through the Bible. We see leaders who have emotional intelligence and we see leaders who lack emotional intelligence. So when we look at the Bible, I think it confirms for us that this is an important aspect of leadership. In some ways, the supreme example, of course, is God himself. God is a communicating God. And God, because he knows everything, knows us perfectly. And therefore, God communicates to us in the perfect way. He engages with us, knowing what kind of people we are and knowing the exact situations we're in. We see that happening in the Bible as God speaks to his people, for example, through the prophets. Sometimes God knows that what his people need is a strong rebuke for their sin, for their rebellion, for their idolatry. And God speaks to his people harshly. At other times, he knows that they are wounded and bruised, and what they need is encouragement. And so he speaks to them words of comfort. God exercises, you might call it, an emotional intelligence in relation to the way he speaks to his people. Of course, we see that very clearly in the ministry of Jesus. I think one of the striking things about Jesus is the way that he relates to different people. He doesn't have a simple script that he uses with everyone as if everyone's the same. Jesus adjusts his communication, what he says and how he says it, to the different people that he encounters. So just think of Jesus at the beginning of John's Gospel, as he meets on the one hand the Samaritan woman and Nicodemus. Nicodemus is one of the leaders of the people of Israel. He should know the law. And so Jesus challenges him. Don't you know that you need to be born again to enter the kingdom? You're supposed to be a teacher. You're an expert. And so Jesus challenges him. The Samaritan woman, she is a vulnerable outcast. She comes to Jesus by the well when it's the middle of the day. Nobody in the village has anything to do with her because of her sexual and marital history. And Jesus gently draws out the truth from her and then tells her about the living water, the eternal life that he's able to offer. Two very different ways of dealing with people that displays that skill of emotional intelligence. Or think about Jesus dealing differently with Mary and Martha. One of whom wants to sit at his feet and listen to his word, the other of whom is kind of obsessed with the domestic duties. Jesus has a word that's appropriate for each of them. Or the contrast between the way Jesus speaks to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who he denounces as hypocrites, and the way that he speaks to the tax collectors, who he wants to welcome into the kingdom of God. Jesus demonstrates a real emotional intelligence in the way he deals with these different people. I think we find the same, for example, in Paul and his ministry. We see it in the book of Acts in the way he preaches the gospel. He preaches the gospel differently to Jewish people who know the Old Testament, and he preaches the gospel differently to pagans like the philosophers in Athens. He has the same gospel message that Jesus is Lord, and the call to repent and believe to escape the coming judgment, but he speaks in different ways. So to some of the Jewish groups, he tells them, you rejected the Messiah. You put him to death. To the pagans, he said, I see you're very religious, but let me tell you about the unknown God. It's a different tone for the different groups. And we see that in Paul's ministry in his letters. Paul in his letters is usually writing to Christians he knows who are perhaps facing problems or difficulties or challenges, or they've got doubts and questions. And each of his letters has a different tone. So, for example, when he writes to the Thessalonians, he's writing to a new young church that stood firm against persecution. And so he writes to them and he encourages them. He says how much he gives thanks for them and their spiritual progress. And then he says he urges them to do more and more, to love more and more. So he says, you've done well, but now press on and do more and more. It's a loving, encouraging letter. But think about the Galatians. Paul writes to the Galatians when he's heard news that they're in danger of believing the message of the Judaizers. And he's desperately concerned that they don't buy this false teaching. So Paul writes to them and he says, I can't believe you're abandoning the gospel. How could you be so stupid when you believed the gospel and received the Spirit? Why do you think you need to be circumcised? Don't be daft. So there's a different tone in the letters that Paul writes. Perhaps a model of Paul exercising emotional intelligence to lead is his letter to Philemon. You remember in Philemon, Paul is writing to his friend in the church in Colossae, sending back his runaway slave, Onesimus. And he's writing to persuade Philemon to give him this slave to be his support and help. Now, Paul could write to Philemon and say, Philemon, I'm an apostle. You were converted through my ministry. You owe me Onesimus. Please, can I have him? Give him to me. But Paul doesn't write like that. He writes in a way in which he leaves the decision to Philemon, and he invites Philemon to engage in partnership with him. He says, I'm not ordering you. I'm asking you if you'd be willing to serve me and partner with me in this way. Can you see that that is a far more winning way to persuade Philemon to send Onesimus to Paul than simply saying, I'm the apostle, this is what I want you to do, send me Onesimus. See, Paul's not just concerned with getting Onesimus, he wants to win over Philemon to his gospel vision. So there are examples of emotional intelligence, and similarly, we find, I think, that emotional intelligence is amongst the qualities required for church leaders in the Bible. So when we look at the qualities that are required for those who are to be appointed to serve in the church, they involve those qualities of being able to relate well to others. So in Acts chapter 6, when there's the problem between the widows from a kind of a Greek and a Jewish background, the apostles say, appoint some people to sort this issue out. He says, what kind of people should you appoint? Well, in Acts chapter 6, is appoint those who are full of the Spirit and wisdom. I think that wisdom is the skill to be able to cope with these fights between these different groups in the church. It's going to require a lot of empathy with the different groups of widows and the different cultural communities they represent. That's the skill that these men are going to have. 1 Timothy chapter 3, when Paul talks about the criteria for church elders, alongside their gift, their ability to teach, their management skills, most of the characteristics are character qualities. And they're character qualities about being able to relate well to other people. So they're to be temperate and not quick-tempered, to be self-controlled, to be gentle in the way that they relate to others. So church leaders require some of these skills. It's not enough just to be able to teach. You've got to be able to relate well to people. So I think this idea of emotional intelligence, a kind of a wisdom and empathy in relating to others and how to speak to them, communicate with them and persuade them, is very much a biblical idea. Let me just close with a couple of examples of where I think we see that emotional intelligence in the Bible, positive and negative. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, Paul is writing to Timothy and tells him how he's to exercise his ministry in the church. And Timothy is a young man in a position of leadership, and he has to engage a wide variety of different people. This is what Paul advises him. Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Basically saying that have emotional intelligence in the way you pastor the people in your church. I've seen many hot-headed young pastors rebuke older men badly. Paul says, don't. Treat them as though you're the father. You don't treat the older men the same way you treat the younger men. You treat women differently as mothers and sisters. That's just an example of what we have been speaking about. And we can see examples of where there has been a lack of emotional intelligence. Let me give you just a couple. These come from the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 37, you'll remember that Joseph has a series of dreams. He has dreams in which what is being pictured is his brothers bowing down to him, and then even his mother and father bowing down to him. And Joseph, the favored son, runs to his family and says, hey, you won't believe the dream I've just had. You're all going to bow down before me. It's not really very sensitive. And the result is that it produces alienation on the part of his brothers. He shows a lack of that emotional empathy in the way that he reports the dreams that he's had. Or think of 1 Samuel chapter 25. Do you remember the story in 1 Samuel chapter 25? This is when David is a fugitive. And he goes to a man called Nabal, whose sheep he's been looking after. And basically he wants some food for him and his men. And Nabal is an unwise fool. His name means fool. And Nabal basically says, go away. I'm not giving you anything. It's actually a total failure of hospitality. Nabal has no emotional intelligence. But his wife, Abigail, realizes the seriousness of the situation. And so she gathers some food. She goes out, she apologizes to David for the foolishness of her husband. She gives David and his men the food that she's taken. And the offense that was caused, she is able to undo that offense. Abigail demonstrates great emotional intelligence in understanding the situation and in then speaking to David in a way that wins him over. So you have foolish Nabal and wise Abigail. And lastly, let me give you one last example. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, King Rehoboam succeeds his father Solomon. If you remember the story, the people of Israel come to Rehoboam and say, Solomon placed a heavy burden on us as slave labor. Lighten our burden and we'll be loyal to you. Rehoboam thinks about it. He asks the older men, and they say, lighten the burden, win the people over. He speaks to the younger men, and the younger men say, make their burden even heavier. How dare they complain? And Rehoboam listens to the younger men, and so he goes back to the people of Israel, and he says, you thought my father was bad? Well, I'm going to increase your burden. It's not surprising, is it, that the result is the people rebel against him. He shows a total lack of emotional intelligence in the way he deals with his new people, thinking that he can crush them by strength. So those are just some examples of the way that emotional intelligence is relevant to leadership in the Bible. Let me say then just some final things about how to grow in this skill for leading. How do you grow in emotional intelligence? Well, in essence, this emotional intelligence is a combination of wisdom, discernment, and character. So how do we grow in these things? Here are some suggestions. Firstly, the first important thing is to realize that it's needed at all. The first step to growing is realizing the need. Secondly, we need to grow in our Christ-likeness. As we grow in our general Christ-likeness and become more like Jesus, then we should grow in our ability to empathise with others. We will become more loving. We will become more wise. So this is part of our growth in Christ-likeness. Thirdly, listen carefully to the biblical examples and learn from them. We're told in 1 Corinthians that the events of the Bible, the stories, are written for our learning. They're examples for us. As we read the Bible, have our eyes open to learn how to relate to other people well. Fourthly, do make use of other resources and books. I've made a reference to a couple. There are plenty of books out there on leadership that help us develop this skill of emotional intelligence. Read them wisely and discerningly with a pair of biblical spectacles, but we can learn from those other resources. Fifthly, listen to other people. An awful lot of leadership is about listening before speaking. Many of us as leaders are too quick to speak and too slow to listen. We need to take the time to listen to people, find out about them, try to understand them, so that we can then speak wisely into the situation. And listen to people as they speak about themselves. Try to discern what they're like, what they respond positively to, what they respond negatively to. This is easier with a team that you're working in on a regular basis. Find out about the team. Be concerned about their families. Be concerned about what's happening in the rest of their lives so that you can be sensitive in the way that you connect with them. If they're having struggles with a child, or they've got a family member who's ill, or they've got an elderly relative that they're seeking to look after, take that into account. So listen. And then lastly, ask for feedback from others. You want others to give you help. How am I coming across? What are you hearing me say? You may not realise how you're being perceived. And you need people to honestly share with you how you're coming across in your leadership. Sometimes that might be painful, but often it's very helpful to have some trusted friends who are able to feed back to you how you're coming across in your leading. So I hope that's been helpful as just an overview of what I think is a skill that's very important for leading and effective leadership. All of us will become better leaders if we're able to combine our vision, our passion, and our giftings with an emotional intelligence that enables us to communicate and persuade in a more effective way.